This is Jacob Schilling. I'm here with Joseph Berg to collect his oral history for the Digital Veteran Story Project. We are here in the UCCS library in one of the group study rooms. The date is January 14th, 2015. How are you doing, Joe?
Not so bad today. The sun's finally come out, so it's a nice break in the weather here in Colorado. Wow. So, where would you like me to start the story?
Wherever you like, Joe. I'd like to just hear something unique to you, some perspective that you feel not a lot of people have had the opportunity to look at or experience.
Wow. I was part of an interesting generation of officers in the Army. I had 2 years really of peacetime service before the war kicked off. So as a young lieutenant, I saw sort of the tail end of the 90s Army, which was an Army that had been characterized by budget limitations and very much trying to find its way after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Army was still training to fight the Soviet Union, but there wasn't one. And so we kind of didn't know where we were going as an institution. And then I spent the remainder of my career up to 2013 in a wartime Army. And I served long enough to see soldiers and non-commissioned officers and officers grow up that had never known an Army at peace. You know, when you're at war for over a decade, the cultural norms change. So the things that were really important in 2000, some which were kind of picayune. When I started my career, we were wearing black boots that had to be shined every day, and that was important. Everybody starched their uniforms. Like, open the pants legs with a bayonet, starched their uniforms, because that was considered a sign of professionalism. Those were sort of the little things. And the big things, I served in an Army that went from training to fight huge mechanized battles with hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers, massive concentrations of artillery, this sort of Third World War kind of combat scenario, into an Army that was trying to learn how to do counterinsurgency and how to step back from destroy everything in sight to talking to people in the streets more like a police officer. And it was a huge cultural shift, both in the little things and the big things. So that was fascinating to watch, literally watch the culture evolve in front of you. I think in 2003, when we invaded Iraq, no one had any sense that we would still be doing that 10 years later. When I left the Army, I was medically retired as a major in 2013. Every single one of my peers was either divorced, in the middle of a divorce, or worried about getting divorced. And I was, there were nearly 200 majors that I knew professionally within the 4th Infantry Division. Pre-war, it was very rare for an officer to get divorced. About as common as seeing one with a mustache. It just was not a cultural thing, and yet by the time I left, a decade of war had just absolutely ripped the heart out of the cohort of people that I joined the Army with. And I don't say that in the sense that that they had lost their professionalism or they had lost their dedication to doing their jobs, but the personal cost that they had borne. It was a trail of broken families and broken marriages, and I think that a psychic cost. I knew very few people that had served for any length of time that didn't have some kind of psychic injury, whether they would admit it to you or not.
Do you still keep in contact with a fair amount of those people?
Yes. The best friends I made in my life, I made in the Army. In fact, this last weekend I was working on an old Ford Mustang with an NCO that I served with in Iraq in 2011. We've kept in touch, and we have things in common to talk about.
Do you find it's harder with people who haven't served to make those interpersonal connections?
I don't know about individuals, but I can say that kind of culturally, I find myself really disinterested in whatever the latest TV show is, or whatever pop artist is on the radio, and very often I find myself even disinterested in national affairs, politics, things that I used to be very, very tuned into. It all seems to be oftentimes a lot of sound and fury with nothing tangible to it.
What would you say changed your perspective on that? Because you said you had previously been very in tune.
Yeah, oh yeah, I used to have back when CDs were big, I had more CDs than anybody else. I used to listen to music constantly and was something of a pop culture junkie. I think a lot of that changed. After I came back from my first deployment, I got divorced. I did not necessarily deal well with a lot of my experiences in my first deployment. And it's very hard to go from sort of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, everything I do is important, to somebody wants me to think that the introduction of chicken strips at Subway is important. It's hard to shift that gear. I'll never ever forget walking off the back ramp of a C-17 at Ramstein in the middle of the night. The Air Force guys that were our division's Air Force liaison team, they all got off and walked off to the terminal because they're Air Force and they have a lick of sense. All the Army guys are literally sitting in the middle of a hangar waiting for the bus to come get us. But as I'm sitting there in this hangar in the middle of the German winter, I could look across the German highway there at Ramstein, and I could see the golden arches. I could see the McDonald's sign. And as I'm looking at the McDonald's sign, I realize I still have ammunition in my pocket because we had literally been stripping rounds out of magazines 3 hours before because they didn't want us to get on the plane with ammunition. Crazy Air Force rules. And I realized I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with these 3 rounds of M16 ammunition that I had discovered were in my pocket. Whereas literally 3 hours ago, I would have either thrown them in an amnesty barrel or shot them over the fence line. And it was an absolute non-issue. And now here I was back in the land of McDonald's and BMWs. And it was really like shifting gears without a clutch. That first tour in Iraq, I served in Tikrit, I served in Babylon, was in and around the north end of Baghdad, so from what was called Anaconda Balad Air Base, which was on the north side of Baghdad, all the way up. There's one main highway that runs north to south in Iraq. It's their Highway 1. The Army code name for it was MSR Tampa. Long story about the code names for all of this. Originally, a lot of these routes were code named for porn stars, and they realized that was bad for PR, so they changed them all. And so Tampa ran from Baghdad through Samara up to Tikrit, and then north from Tikrit up to Kirkuk. And so that was sort of the northern division's area of responsibility. And Samara, my first tour, had completely fallen to the insurgents. Like we would bypass around the town for about 10 miles because to actually send vehicles through the middle of town was to start a battle. And we actually, during the latter part of that tour, mounted a large operation to return Samara to the control of the Iraqi government. This is the same one the Good Samaritan came from. Mm-hmm. And basically we did it by virtually annihilating everyone in the city. And, you know, it was a big operation. It was heralded as a big success. Looking back on it, I think probably a lot of the people that got hurt were not the insurgents. I think the insurgents, for the most part, fled before the final retaking of the city. So a lot of the people I think that got shot up were people that happened to live in Samara that were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Did the people there generally support the U.S. forces and the Iraqi government, or the insurgents?
My general experience with Iraqis, this is very general, broad brush, was they just wanted to be left the hell alone. Particularly the ones outside of the major urban areas. I mean, once the livable part of Iraq is along the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So in between those two rivers, there's this sort of river valley. I mean, it's Mesopotamia. It's the original birthplace of civilization. The further you get away from those rivers, the more marginal life becomes. And so, generally, the further you got away from those rivers, the more people were interested in trying to make it through the next season with enough food to eat, and the less interested they were in who was in power or what, the politics at that level raised to the level of tribal and didn't go much beyond that. Because my uncle's cousin will lend me food in the winter if I don't have a good enough harvest. Now in the cities it's a little bit different. Baghdad can be as urban and cosmopolitan as any American city, and all the politics that would go along with any American city of that size. But there was a real difference between the urbanites and the rural populations in Iraq. Gosh, I don't even really know where I was headed with it. My job, my first tour, for the most part, There were some exceptions, but I spent most of my time as battle captain for the division, which is the guy that answers the phone at the division level when something happens. So whatever fighting, whatever conflict was occurring in northern Iraq, if it was during the 12 hours that I was on shift, I was the first person at the division level to pick up the phone and say, what's going on? What can we do to help? To bring aircraft into the fight, to coordinate across unit boundaries. When I was listening to your story about being a medic, it struck me like how much responsibility we give to people very, very young in the Army. I was 26 maybe at the time, and I was basically the combat air traffic controller. Air traffic, by analogy, I wasn't actually the air traffic controller, but my job was to deconflict all of the combat missions that were happening in northern Iraq at any given moment in time. Things would happen like, the division commander would get in his helicopter and he'd fly somewhere, and he would be talking to the local potentate or whatever. And when he got back in his helicopter afterwards, the first radio call he made was to me. And I'm, lowly captain on the division staff, but my responsibility was to tell him everything that had happened in his division's battle space for the last 2 hours. Every IAD, every firefight, I was expected to know. And some of the generals in the division would literally play stomp the chump. Like they would fly over a firefight. Just happened to be on their route. They would fly over, look down, happen to see a firefight going on, and would ask you over the radio to tell them about something that they were seeing with their own eyes to see whether or not you knew about it and you were paying attention to what was going on. So it was 12 hours on, 12 hours off for the better part of a year, constantly having to be minute to minute read on. Where was every convoy in the battle space? Could we drop a bomb there? Were there friendly units there? Can we fire artillery there? All of that came across my desk. The worst phone call I ever got was I picked up the phone one day and it was this convoy, and it was a civilian convoy. It was an AFES convoy, the people that run the PX.
Right. Who bring you your little toothpaste and deodorant and whatnot.
Right, your razor, your, whatever. They had sent this convoy up from Kuwait without any military escort. So it's literally like 3 Americans and an SUV followed by a convoy of 10 to 12 semi-trucks driven by probably Malays, which is who the Kuwaitis usually hired to do work like that. Driving up MSR Tampa, and they had come under fire. There were a couple of the drivers had been killed. The insurgents were looting the trucks. And I'm talking to this middle-aged woman who has worked for the post-exchange for her entire career. And I'm trying to coax her into telling me where in Iraq she is. She's talking to me over a satellite phone. I can hear the bullets hitting the vehicle she's in, and I have no idea where in Iraq this woman is. I don't know how the hell she has my phone number, but now that I'm on the phone with her, she's my problem. And they eventually abandoned the local national drivers. They just got in their SUV and drove off, and she happened to read a road sign to me. And after about 3 minutes of detective work on the map, we found where they were. She was hundreds of miles south of where I was. She was in another division's area of responsibility. there was nothing I could do for her. I didn't have the authority to do anything to help this woman who was, literally screaming at me on the phone about people being blown apart with RPGs. The only thing I could do was call the division headquarters who were responsible for that piece of terrain and say, look, this is the situation. These people have just been massacred, and I couldn't do anything to help. And I've never felt more angry and more helpless. I was there when they strung those contractors up on the Samara bridge and burned their bodies. And this was a very similar sort of situation. I was always very angry about there were a couple times in the war where the U.S. government would declare troop reductions, and they would bring in soldiers home from Iraq, and the way they pulled that off was they would hire these security contractors to take up the slack for where there weren't soldiers to do the jobs anymore. Essentially, the government was hiring mercenaries to do the jobs of soldiers. There are real problems with mercenaries. Amongst other things, if I hire a guy off the street, call him a security contractor, and send him to Iraq, and he gets his leg blown off, he can't go to the VA. He doesn't have a government-issued life insurance policy. He gets squat. He gets fired from the company he works for because he doesn't have a leg anymore.
Can't do his job.
And, oh, by the way, you get these guys that had minimal training and minimal qualifications. I don't care how much you try and distance yourself from Blackwater. They represent the nation now. So you get these cowboys running around on the battlefield who are not subject to the laws, discipline, regulation of the United States Army, and are perfectly free to commit atrocities in the name of the United States that, we deny because that was some contractor. But the truth is the American government is just as responsible for it as if an American soldier had done it.
I'm sure the Iraqis felt similarly.
Yeah, no, the Iraqis were very upset about it. In my final tour in 2011, where we literally were shutting down the American presence in the country, I think the American populace would have been shocked to know that our entire installation in Iraq was guarded by Ugandan mercenaries. The people in the watchtowers guarding the installation were not Iraqi soldiers because we didn't trust them, and they were not American soldiers because we didn't have enough of them. They were mercenaries from Uganda that were being paid the equivalent of 75 cents an hour, whose legal status was ambiguous, to say the least. And it did not strike me as an honest way to do business. We were willing to start a war, we were willing to break the place, but we weren't willing to invest the lives. It's what it comes down to, that we weren't willing to invest the American lives that it would have taken to have fixed the country correctly. That's my 2 cents on the Iraq War.
Fair enough. Now, Joe, I wanted to ask you, earlier you were talking about being battle captain and having a direct influence on things that came across your desk for the most part, but the frustrating times came when you could not have an impact on what was going on around you. Do you ever run into that now that you're out?
Oh, yeah. It's just the difference now is that nobody's life's on the line. That's what makes it And I deliberately stay away from that kind of responsibility now. I don't want it anymore. I am amazed sometimes, looking back, at the sheer number of data points that I used to be able to keep in my head. You know, how many aircraft were on station, how many helicopters were on station, what the response range was of the Apaches that were already statused, how many Apaches were already statused at any given moment, where the scout helicopters from the Cav squadron were at this moment, who has what units are conducting combat missions tonight, where those combat missions are, what the size of the combat missions are, where are the special operations task forces operating tonight, what time are the Air Force electronic operations birds going to operate tonight, what's the news cycle in Washington D.C. right now, what is going on in negotiations with the Kurdish government? What have we reached the coordination points for the Korean unit that is moving through our sector we moved one up into the Kurdish area because the Korean government wanted to support our effort, but they didn't want their troops to be anywhere they might actually be shot at. So we put them up in Kurd land. Used to be able to keep all of that on the end of my mind and be able to rattle it off every single day. I can't do that anymore. I'm doing good to keep up with what time I eat every day now. The faculty that I used to have to be able to manage and coordinate massive amounts of information, somewhere along the line it burned up or burned out, and it's really frustrating to me now. Incredibly frustrating. It was like the greatest talent I had, and I don't have it anymore.
That makes sense. Now, did you know you had that talent before they made you battle captain? I know as lieutenant you don't get a ton of responsibility. They try and ease you in. But you mentioned taking on this giant responsibility at a young age. How did you do it?
I grew up well. My lieutenant years were spent with the 7th Cavalry at Fort Hood. And at least in those days, the great thing about being the division cavalry squadron was you were not part of any of the division's brigades. So the way they came up with a training budget for that cavalry squadron was they were essentially the division's in-house opposing force. So every single brigade that went through a training rotation at Fort Hood, we played the bad guys. And we were always in the field. We were always maneuvering. When the Twin Towers fell, my troop was on flyaway for the 82nd. They had a company's worth of tanks and Bradleys that were, as soon as the 82nd went somewhere, they were to arrive at the first secured airfield in order to provide armored support to the 82nd Airborne Division after they got rid of their airdroppable tanks in the late 90s. So we were on flyaway. When the towers came down, literally, I got the message over a tactical radio because we were in the middle of a training exercise. And the message that we got was, grab your equipment out of the back of your vehicles and go to the airfield because somebody's attacked America. The first unit that's going to be deployed in response is the 82nd, and if the 82nd goes, you're going with them. So that's where I was on September 11th. It was a great outfit to grow up in. the old cavalry outfits were designed to be very, very mobile, very, very tooth heavy and personnel light. And so, as an executive officer in a cavalry squadron for several of the troops, it wasn't unusual for me to have 4 or 5 radio hand mics going at any one time, because we'd be spread out. Doctrinally, we were supposed to be responsible for 30 to 100 kilometers of frontage. I mean, we might have 5 miles between sections of the cavalry squadron. This was designed to be a reconnaissance outfit, and so I grew up as an officer learning how to track lots of little different pieces of everything. Plus, the cavalry squadrons in those days had helicopters that were organic to them. So I learned air operations as a tank officer, which is something I wouldn't have been exposed to in a different kind of unit. I mean, I've flown helicopters badly and for very short periods of time, but I have done it, and it gave me a sense of how different the world appears and how differently you interact with the world when you're flying a helicopter than if you're crawling through the woods on your belly. So I had a great growing up education, and I think it prepared me to kind of step into that role. I was just doing what I'd done before on a bigger scale. And then in between my tours, I was very ill, diagnosed with cancer after my first tour, and it was very hard for me to not go on my second tour that I was supposed to go on. It was literally a week before the brigade was supposed to start deploying to Iraq in 2006. The doctor called me up and said, "You're not going to Iraq, you're going to Walter Reed to be treated for cancer." So I watched a lot of that tour from a hospital bed, which was really hard to do. And then I came back, and I was on convalescent leave after my last round of chemotherapy. I was being fed through a feeding tube because it was a head and neck cancer. The treatment had destroyed my throat, my mouth, to the point where I couldn't swallow solid food anymore. I was walking with a cane, and I got a phone call from the brigade commander who said, "Joe, I need you to take command." And I literally did, like, I took the phone away from my ear and stared at it for a minute, and I put it back to my ear. I said, "Sir, you do know I'm on convalescent leave." He said, "Joe, I know that. The person that is in command of the rear detachment right now, her husband has just been killed. She was married to another officer in the unit, and she's in labor, which was the reason she hadn't deployed." And he said, "She's not going to be able to continue as the commander, and I need an officer with a commission that can take command of the unit." He said, "Can you sit at a desk and administer a unit, sign Article 15s and do that sort of stuff?" And I said, "Sir, I'm pretty wobbly." He said, "I need you." So I left convalescent leave early and took command. And literally, when I took the guide on to assume command, I could not eat solid food. That was the beginning of my experience as a company commander of the Army.
Now, someone from outside the military might look on that and say, "That's a complete disaster, it probably ended badly, etc., etc." Being a veteran myself, I know that sometimes when you're needed, you step up. How did it go for you?
It went well, actually. I had a good experience in command, largely because I was blessed in having good non-commissioned officers that had remained with the unit. So, for a variety of reasons, but they were good, competent people that I could trust. I got a couple of returnees from theater for injuries, but injuries that didn't prevent them from being able to come to work. I had some folks that were just, NCOs that were a little past their prime, but they had been in the Army for so long they knew how to do everything. And my own experience with having severe medical problems actually helped me relate to a lot of the soldiers that I was working with on the rear detachment. So my command went really pretty well, largely not because of the things that I did. It also probably was one of the worst personal mistakes I've ever made.
Why is that?
Because all of the things that I hadn't dealt with from my first deployment, all the things I hadn't dealt with from dying of cancer, I didn't deal with then either. Because being a commander is an all-consuming thing, all hours of the day and night. There were a lot of times when I was running on stimulants and painkillers at the same time in order to be able to function. That caught up with me in 2008 and 2009, and really, I'm only now kind of starting to recover from pushing myself so hard and not convalescing. I think a lot of the emotional and the physical injuries I've had, I would have recovered from much faster and much earlier if I had had the time then, as opposed to limping along until it became such a crisis that I couldn't function anymore. I'm really proud of what I did in my second tour in Iraq in 2011. Basically the division, I came into theater, the division chief of staff said, Joe, I'm not happy with how we're closing the base here in Tikrit. I don't have a good feeling that we're doing it well. Go fix it. That was my mandate. Go fix it, come back and see me if you have problems. And the base at Tikrit at that point was nearly 30,000 people. Over half of which were civilian contractors. It was as big as Fort Leavenworth. It had its own airport, it had its own fire department, it had its own police force, it had its own sewage system, it had its own electric generating plant. It was a miniature city that was entirely administered by the United States Army. It also included the Iraqi Air Force Academy, which happened to live on the same base as well. It was an enormous undertaking, and I'm really proud that we successfully closed that base. At the end of it, Chief asked me, he said, Joe, if this was a success, why have I signed off on $50,000 worth of property loss? And I told him, I said, well, sir, it's a success because that's less than 0.1% of the property that's here.
It's a lot different when you look at the percentages, isn't it?
And that was my last deployment. I was really proud of how things went. I had a great team. I had civilians, Army civilians that came from stateside to help with that project. I had NCOs. There were good defense contractors that helped me with that made it possible. I had the backing of the division's leadership. it was a dream assignment, and it went off wonderfully. It also was kind of the end of me as a military officer, because the way I got the mission done was basically by covering up all of the issues that I had in my life at that time, which included a pretty strong addiction to painkillers at that point. I literally had a schedule running of when I could be stoned and when I had to be in pain, but I had to be fully mentally functional. Down to 4-hour increments, because that's about how long the painkillers stayed in my system. And I don't think I'm a hero for that. I think I'm an idiot for that. I will probably be paying for the rest of my life for not getting the help, not getting the cure that I needed. It cost me my second marriage. Right now, it's cost me being able to be a father to my 2 children. I'm proud of it, but I'm not sure that the cost has been worth it. Particularly when I see ISIL dudes standing on the street corners of Tikrit waving AK-47s and shooting in the air.
Right. Well, Joe, I think that was a really good, complete picture of you as an Army officer. I mean, would you agree?
There's a lot to tell. I would, just to say in closing, because I know other people will listen to this, I work with some great human beings, officers, enlisted, non-commissioned officers. I met, I'd say fewer than 5% of the people I met in the United States Army that I did not think were genuinely committed to trying to do what was right. Right for the nation, right for the commitment that they had made to the Army. I was overwhelmed by the dedication that I saw. So I think there have been places where I've sounded critical. I think there were a lot of mistakes and things that nobody could have seen when all of this started. And that's kind of the way history unfolds. But I don't think that for a lot of the bad things that happened, I don't think it was that anybody set out to do anything wrong. I think it was just, there's no perfection in human endeavors, and when you make errors at the highest level of policy, the effect is so colossally magnified that it's unforgiving. I have a lot of sympathy for the people that occupy the Oval Office, because they have to make decisions like that every day, and a lot of people are either going to prosper or suffer based on what a regular human being can figure out as right and wrong. So.
That was really well put. Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome.
So in closing, again, I'm Jacob Schilling here with Joseph Berg at the UCCS Library in a group study room on the 14th of January, 2015. And this has been his story.